What if the one face you'd spent 40 years trying to forget walked into your diner on a Tuesday afternoon? Rose Keller stood at the counter of Millie's diner, wiping down the same coffee-stained formica she'd wiped 1,000 times before when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up out of habit, the way she always did, expecting the usual faces from town. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. The man wore an expensive dark suit that seemed too fine for their little corner of Pennsylvania, his silver hair slicked back, and when he met her eyes across the diner, she saw recognition flicker there too. Her fingers went numb. The dish rag slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a wet slap. It couldn't be him. Not after all these years, not here. Where are you watching from? Rose had been working at Millie's diner for the past 15 years, ever since her husband Frank passed and left her with more bills than savings. At 72, her back ached by the end of every shift, but she never complained. The regulars were kind, tipping what they could, and the work kept her mind busy. Her small apartment above the hardware store cost more each year, and lately she'd been picking up extra shifts just to keep the lights on. Her daughter Linda called from Arizona every Sunday, always offering to send money, always getting the same answer. Rose didn't want charity. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet for as long as the good Lord allowed. The man in the expensive suit took a booth in the back corner, away from the window. Rose's hands trembled as she gathered her notepad. She told herself she was being foolish. It had been 4 decades. People changed, memory played tricks, but when she approached his table and looked into those pale blue eyes, she knew. Knew with the same certainty she'd known at 18 when she'd loved him with every foolish fiber of her young heart. "Coffee, please," he said quietly. His voice had deepened with age, but she recognized the careful way he pronounced his words, like each one mattered. "And maybe a slice of that apple pie I see in the case." Rose's mouth felt dry as cotton. "Coming right up," she managed, her voice barely steady. She poured his coffee with shaking hands, trying not to spill. Her mind raced backward through the years. Tommy Marchetti, the boy from the wrong side of Pittsburgh, who'd promised her the world when she was barely more than a girl. He'd been handsome and wild, the kind of dangerous that seemed romantic when you were young and stupid. They'd talked about running away together, about leaving Pennsylvania and starting fresh somewhere new. Then one night he'd shown up at her parents' house with blood on his shirt and terror in his eyes. He'd told her to forget him, that he was in trouble she couldn't imagine, that men were after him, and anyone close to him would get hurt. She'd cried and begged him to stay, but by morning he was gone. 2 weeks later, she'd learned she was pregnant. Rose served his pie with trembling fingers, careful not to make eye contact. The diner was quiet that afternoon, just old Mr. Henderson reading his newspaper by the window and a young couple sharing fries at the counter. She retreated behind the register, watching Tommy eat slowly, deliberately, like he was buying time. He left the pie half-finished and signaled for the check. When Rose brought it over, he was already counting out cash from a thick leather wallet. "Keep the change," he said, pressing several bills into her palm along with a folded piece of paper. His fingers were warm, and for just a second they lingered against hers. She looked down. $100 bills, 10 of them. Her throat tightened. "Sir, I can't read the note," he interrupted softly. "Please, when you're alone." He stood buttoning his suit jacket. His eyes held something she couldn't name. "Regret, maybe, or fear. I'm at the Riverside Hotel, room 304, if you want to talk." He paused at the door, glancing back one more time. "You look good, Rosie. You always did." Then he was gone, leaving her standing there with $10,000 and a piece of paper that suddenly felt heavy as lead. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced around the diner, making sure no one was watching, then carefully unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, controlled, nothing like the messy scrawl she remembered from his teenage years. But the words hit her like a physical blow. "I know about our son. I'm sorry it took me 40 years. I'm dying, Rose. Pancreatic cancer. 3 months, maybe less. I need to make things right before I go. Please, let me explain. Let me help. Tommy." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Our son, he knew. How did he know? She'd never told anyone except Frank, who'd married her knowing the truth, and loved the boy like his own. David. Her beautiful boy who'd grown into a good man, a teacher now with kids of his own. David, who believed Frank was his father, who'd never asked questions about his dark Italian features that looked nothing like Frank's Norwegian coloring. Rose's chest felt tight. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the diner pressed in on her. She heard herself make a sound, half gasp, half sob, and then her feet were moving, carrying her toward the back door. She pushed through into the alley, the cold autumn air hitting her face like a slap. She ran. Not toward anything, just away. Her sensible work shoes slapping against the pavement, the note crumpled in her fist, and the money forgotten on the counter inside. Rose made it 2 blocks before her legs gave out. She sank onto a bench outside the post office, gasping for air, her mind spinning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, and she watched people go about their ordinary lives. Mrs. Chen locking up her flower shop, the Martin boys riding their bikes toward the park. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but Rose's entire world had just cracked open. She looked at the note again, Tommy's words blurring through her tears. 3 months. Dying. After 40 years of silence, he was dying. And now he wanted to make things right. What did that even mean? How do you make right a lifetime of absence? She thought about David. Her steady, dependable David with his gentle hands and patient way of explaining algebra to frustrated teenagers. He'd mourned Frank deeply when he passed, spent weeks sorting through his father's things, keeping a box of Frank's old tools in his garage like sacred relics. What would it do to him to learn the truth now? Rose's phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text from her coworker Shelley. "You okay? You left your purse here." That money still on the counter. Rose's stomach dropped. The $10,000. She'd just left it sitting there. She typed back quickly, put it in the safe. "Be back in 20. She walked home slowly, trying to compose herself. Her apartment was small but tidy, filled with photographs of David and his children, of Frank smiling from fishing trips and Christmas mornings. She'd built a good life from the ashes of that heartbreak. She'd raised David right, given him everything she could. And Frank, God rest his soul, had been the real father in every way that mattered. Biology was just biology. But the money, $10,000. She did the math in her head. It would cover 3 months of rent, the dental work she'd been putting off, maybe even a plane ticket to see Linda without having to save for months. It was more money than she'd seen at once in years. And Tommy was dying. The thought carved something hollow in her chest that surprised her. That evening, Rose sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. She hadn't called David, hadn't decided anything. The note lay on the table like an accusation. Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed Linda. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice was warm, concerned. "It's Wednesday. You never call on Wednesday." "What's wrong?" Rose's throat tightened. "Do you remember me ever mentioning someone named Tommy Marchetti?" There was a pause. "No, should I?" "Probably not." Rose closed her eyes. "It's a long story, honey. A very long story." She told Linda everything, about Tommy and their young love, about the blood and the sudden disappearance, about Frank's kindness and the secret she'd kept for 40 years. Linda listened without interrupting, and when Rose finally fell silent, her daughter let out a long breath. "Mom," Linda said quietly, "does David know any of this?" "No," Frank and I agreed. "It would only confuse him, hurt him. Frank was his father, is his father. But this man, Tommy, he has a right to know his son, and David has a right to know where he came from." Linda's voice was gentle but firm. "And Mom? If he's really dying, maybe this is a gift, a chance to get answers, to understand." Rose wiped her eyes. "What if it ruins everything? What if David hates me for lying all these years?" "David could never hate you," Linda said. "But he might hate not having the choice to meet his biological father before it's too late." After they hung up, Rose sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about all the years she'd wondered about Tommy, where he'd gone. If he'd thought about her, if he'd lived the life he'd dreamed of, or if he'd drowned in whatever trouble had chased him away. She thought about her 18-year-old self, so heartbroken and terrified, clutching a positive pregnancy test and knowing she had to be brave. She'd been so young. Around 9 o'clock, Rose picked up her phone again. She opened her text messages and found David's name. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard. Finally, she typed, "Can you come over tomorrow? Need to talk to you about something important." His reply came quickly. "Of course, Mom. Everything okay?" "It will be," she wrote back, hoping it was true. "If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Rose looked at the note one more time before folding it carefully and placing it in her jewelry box, next to her wedding ring from Frank and the hospital bracelet from the day David was born. Tomorrow she would tell her son the truth. Tomorrow she would decide whether to go to that hotel room and face the man who'd left her 4 decades ago. But tonight she would remember. Remember what it felt like to be young and in love, before the world got complicated, before choices had consequences that echoed through generations. She fell asleep with tears on her pillow and woke to her phone ringing at dawn. It was a number she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she answered. "Rose?" Tommy's voice was rough, urgent. "Don't hang up, please. There's something else you need to know. Something I couldn't write in the note. It's about why I left, about who I really am. And Rose," his voice cracked, "it's about who's been watching over David all these years." Rose sat up in bed, her heart racing. "What do you mean, watching over him?" Tommy exhaled slowly. "Can we meet? I need to show you something. It's not what you think, Rose. None of it is what you think." 2 hours later, Rose sat across from Tommy in his hotel room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. He looked worse in the morning light, thinner, grayish, the illness showing in the hollows of his cheeks. On the table between them lay a thick manila folder. "I was never in the Mafia," Tommy said quietly. "I know that's what you probably thought all these years. What everyone thought." He opened the folder, pulled out a badge. "I was FBI, Rose. Undercover. I was 17 when they recruited me, 18 when they sent me into Pittsburgh's crime families. That blood on my shirt that night? It wasn't mine. I just witnessed a murder. They pulled me out fast, gave me a new identity, relocated me. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone." Rose stared at him, her mind struggling to process. 40 years. You couldn't call once in 40 years? "I tried." His voice broke. "God, Rose, I tried, but they said you'd be in danger. My cover was deep. There were people who wanted me dead, who'd use anyone connected to me, so I watched from a distance." He pulled out photographs. David as a little boy, gap-toothed and grinning. David at his high school graduation. David's wedding day. I hired someone, a private investigator who sent me pictures, updates. I knew everything, Rose. His first word. His first day of school. When Frank died and you cried at the funeral. When David got his teaching job. I've known him his whole life, just from the shadows. Rose's hands trembled as she looked through the photographs. There were dozens of them. A chronicle of her son's entire life, collected by a man who'd loved him from a distance. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why tell me now?" "Because I'm dying and I'm done with secrets." Tommy pulled out another document, medical records, grim and clinical. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I've got maybe 10 weeks left and I want to meet him, just once. I want to look my son in the eye and tell him I'm sorry, that I loved him every single day. That leaving was the hardest thing I ever did." Rose felt something shift in her chest. All these years she'd carried anger like a stone, believing Tommy had abandoned them, chosen crime and danger over love. But he'd been protecting them. He'd sacrificed everything. His love, his son, his chance at a normal life, to keep them safe. "David's coming over this afternoon," she said softly. "I was going to tell him about you. I just didn't know how. Let me help," Tommy said. "Let me be there. I know I have no right to ask, but—" "You have every right," Rose interrupted. "You're his father. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." They spent the morning talking, filling in 40 years of gaps. Tommy told her about his years in witness protection, the fake identity he'd maintained, the loneliness that had eaten at him like acid. He'd never married, never had other children. "Couldn't," he said simply. "You were it for me, Rosie. You and him. Always." Rose told him about Frank, about how good he'd been to David, how he'd loved that boy fiercely and without reservation. "He was David's real father," she said firmly. "You need to understand that. You can't walk in and try to replace him." "I don't want to replace anyone," Tommy said. "I just want him to know I existed, that I cared, that I would have been there if I could." At 3 o'clock, Rose's doorbell rang. Her stomach clenched. This was it. No going back. Tommy stood behind her as she opened the door, and David's smile faltered when he saw the stranger in his mother's living room. "Mom, what's going on?" Rose reached for her son's hand. "Come in, honey, sit down. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." She glanced at Tommy, who nodded encouragement. "This is Tommy Marchetti, and David, he's your biological father." The color drained from David's face. He looked between them, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, he took a step backward. "What? No, Dad, Frank was my father." "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Please," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "Please just listen. Let us explain." But David was already shaking his head, already reaching for the door. I can't do this." He looked at Tommy with something close to horror. "I don't know who you are, but you're not my father. Frank Keller was my father." This is crazy." The door slammed behind him and Rose sank onto the couch, sobbing. Tommy knelt beside her, his own eyes wet. "He'll come back," he said quietly. "Give him time. This is a lot." But as the afternoon faded into evening and David didn't answer his phone, Rose wondered if she'd just destroyed the most important relationship in her life by trying to save another. 3 days passed in painful silence. Rose called David a dozen times. She texted. She even drove to his house, but his wife Beth answered the door with an apologetic look and said David wasn't ready to talk. Tommy remained at the hotel, his condition visibly deteriorating, and Rose found herself visiting him each afternoon, bringing soup he barely touched, sitting with him as he told her stories about his life. On the 4th morning, Rose received a call from Beth. "He wants to meet him," she said quietly. "Can you arrange it? Maybe somewhere neutral." David's been reading through his dad's, Frank's, old letters. "I think he's trying to make sense of everything." They met at the park, the same one where Rose had pushed David on swings when he was little. Tommy sat on a bench, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the mild weather, and Rose stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. David approached slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face guarded. "Thank you for coming," Tommy said, his voice hoarse. David didn't sit. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed. "My wife said I should hear you out, that I'd regret it if I didn't." He looked at Rose. "Mom says you were FBI, that you were protecting us." "That's right." Tommy pulled out his old badge, the photographs. "I loved your mother more than I knew how to say. When I found out she was pregnant..." "How did you find out?" David interrupted. "Mom never told anyone but Dad." Tommy smiled sadly. "Frank told me. About 10 years ago. He tracked me down through the bureau and he called me. Said I had a right to know I had a son, even if I couldn't be part of his life. He sent me a picture of you and said, 'He's a good man. I raised him right, but you should know he exists.' That's the kind of father he was. Generous enough to share the truth with me, even when he didn't have to." David's eyes widened. "Dad knew? He knew about you and never said anything?" "He protected you," Tommy said. "From all of it. The danger I'd brought, the complications. He loved you enough to keep you safe from my world." He paused, coughing. "I'm not here to replace him, son. I couldn't if I tried. Frank Keller was your father in every way that matters. I'm just a man who made hard choices and lived with the consequences. And I wanted to meet you once, to tell you that every day of your life, I thought about you." "Every single day," David's jaw clenched. Rose saw the war in his eyes. Anger and curiosity, grief and something that might have been compassion. Finally, he sat down on the bench, keeping distance between himself and Tommy. "Tell me about your life," he said quietly. "The real one. What happened after you left?" For the next 2 hours, Tommy talked. He told stories about his years undercover, the criminals he'd helped put away, the times he'd almost been killed. He told David about the day he'd held that first photograph of him as a baby and cried in his empty apartment. He talked about the career he'd built afterward, the quiet life in Montana where he'd worked as a consultant for law enforcement, always alone, always wondering about the son he couldn't claim. David listened, and slowly his posture softened. "I have kids," he said eventually. "2 girls. Emma's 10, Sophie's 7. Tommy's face lit up. "I know. I have pictures." He pulled out more photographs. David's daughters at school plays, birthday parties, moments a grandfather might cherish. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for every moment I missed. Every birthday, every milestone. I'm sorry I wasn't there." "You were there," David said slowly. "In your own way. You were always there." He looked at Rose, then back at Tommy. "I don't know if I can call you Dad. That word belongs to someone else. But maybe I can learn to know you, for whatever time is left." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Tommy reached out tentatively, and after a moment, David took his hand. Rose watched her son, and the man she'd once loved clasp hands across a gap of 40 years, and something inside her finally began to heal. They talked until the sun started setting, and when they finally stood to leave, David said, "Come to dinner tomorrow. Meet Beth and the girls properly. They should know their grandfather." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that very much." As they walked back to their cars, David pulled Rose aside. "Mom, thank you for telling me, for giving me this chance." He hugged her tightly. "I'm not angry. I understand why you did what you did, and I'm glad I get to know him, even if it's just for a little while." But that night, Rose received a call from the hotel. Tommy had collapsed. The hospital. Stage 4 meant time was running out faster than anyone had expected. Tommy spent 5 days in the hospital before the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. They moved him to hospice care, a quiet room with windows overlooking a garden where birds gathered at a feeder. Rose visited every day, and David came after school with stories about his students, about the girls, about ordinary life that Tommy drank in like water. Emma and Sophie visited too, shy at first, but warming to this gentle stranger who asked them questions about their favorite books and teachers. Tommy had bought them each a savings bond with money from his life insurance. "For college," he told David. "Let them know their grandfather wanted to help." On the 8th day, Linda flew in from Arizona. She sat with Tommy and thanked him for loving her mother, even from a distance. "She never forgot you," Linda said. "I think part of her always wondered." Tommy smiled weakly. "I never forgot her either. Best thing that ever happened to me was loving Rose Keller, even if I only got to do it for a little while." The family gathered in his room that evening. Rose, David, Beth, the girls, Linda, and her husband. They told stories and laughed at old memories. Tommy dozed between conversations, waking to smile at faces he'd spent 40 years wanting to see. Around 9 o'clock, he asked to speak to David alone. Rose stepped into the hallway with the others, giving them privacy. Through the window, she watched father and son hold hands, watched David wipe tears from his face, watched Tommy lift a trembling hand to touch his son's cheek. She didn't know what they said to each other. But when David emerged 15 minutes later, his face was peaceful. "He said he was proud of me," David told Rose, his voice thick with emotion. "He said Frank did a better job raising me than he ever could have. That I should remember Frank as my father, always, but know that 2 men loved me enough to want the best for me." He pulled Rose into a hug. "He loves you, Mom. He wanted you to know that. He always has." Tommy slipped away quietly just before dawn, Rose holding one hand and David holding the other. The nurses said it was peaceful, that he'd seemed ready, that some people just waited until they had permission to go. The funeral was small, just family and a handful of Tommy's former colleagues from the bureau who came to pay their respects to a man who'd sacrificed everything for his country and never asked for recognition. They buried him in the cemetery next to Frank. David had suggested it, and Rose had agreed. They were both his fathers, David said at the service. They both loved him in their own ways. It feels right that they're together now, watching over him. Rose used part of Tommy's money. He'd left her everything, including the proceeds from selling his Montana house, to finally visit Linda without worrying about bills. She used more of it to establish a small scholarship fund in Frank's name at the high school where David taught, and she put the rest in savings for emergencies and occasional spoiling of her granddaughters. Life returned to its rhythms. Rose still worked at Millie's diner, though she cut back her hours. She spent more time with David and the girls, making up for the years she'd been too tired or too busy. She framed one of Tommy's photographs, the one of her as a young girl, laughing at something beyond the camera's view, and kept it on her dresser next to her wedding photo with Frank. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Rose would take out the note Tommy had written that day in the diner. She'd read it again, remembering the shock and fear and hope that had flooded through her. But mostly she remembered what came after, the conversations, the reconciliation, the gift of those final days when her son got to know his biological father and make peace with a complicated truth. David had found a box in Tommy's belongings, 40 years of cards he'd written and never sent, birthday cards, Father's Day cards, cards for every milestone he'd missed. Rose helped David read through them one rainy afternoon, both of them crying and laughing at Tommy's messages. Happy 10th birthday, son. I hope you got the bike you wanted. Love, the father you don't know. And congratulations on your graduation. I'm so proud of you. I always have been. He was there, David said, wiping his eyes. All those years he was there in his own way. We just couldn't see him. Rose understood something then that she hadn't before. Love wasn't always about presents. Sometimes it was about sacrifice. Sometimes it was about letting go so others could be safe, even when letting go broke your heart into pieces. Tommy had loved them enough to disappear. Frank had loved them enough to stay. And both men, in their own ways, had given David the gift of being cherished. As the seasons changed and life moved forward, Rose found herself grateful. Grateful for the messy, complicated truth that had finally come to light. Grateful for the chance to understand what Tommy had sacrificed. Grateful most of all for the time they'd been given, brief but precious, to be a family before it was too late. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, it's never too late for truth, for forgiveness, or for love to find its way home.